Well, welcome. I'm so glad that you guys are back here again today. We're going to be continuing in our series in Ruth titled "Ordinary People, Extraordinary God." And last week we kind of opened this thing up, and we started talking about our circumstances. We kind of looked at how terrible circumstances, how good circumstances can all be an invitation from God to kind of step into something that He's doing, whether it's a circumstance that is a bad circumstance, that's an invitation for us to step back towards God and potentially repent of sin, to clarify some things that maybe we have misunderstood in our life that don't align with what He's asking us to do. If we have blessings in our life, if we have good things going on in our life, that is an invitation to step out and bear witness to someone. It is an opportunity for us to be generous to someone. It's an opportunity for us to speak life into someone else. And so last week our big challenge was that we wanted to see our circumstances as invitations to join God in His extraordinary work in the world. You know, again, if we're seeing these things, if we're seeing our circumstances, if we're seeing all of the activity around us, if we see these as invitations into something that God is doing, then that can kind of shift the way we see it, right? We may be in a bad circumstance, and if we look at that and we say, okay, hang on a second, what is God trying to say to me in this circumstance? What's going on with this thing, really? If we kind of hit the pause button and take a look at it and say, okay, what's God inviting me to do in this? If we have something great that's going on, if we get a promotion at work, if there's just a really great season in our marriage, if there's something that, you know, God is really kind of pouring out blessings on us with, what is that an invitation to do? All right, if it's a good season in our marriage, let's go and encourage someone else who may not have a great marriage going on right now. If we're experiencing, financial blessings, how can we be generous? How can we give of our resources to those who are in need? And so as we kind of processed through last week, we really wanted to make sure that as we experience these different circumstances, that we really kind of challenge ourselves to see them as an opportunity to join God. And this week, as we're going to dig into things, as we're continuing to think about God's extraordinary work and how we can experience His extraordinary in the midst of our ordinary, the thing that I think we're going to kind of process through today, that we're going to see today, is that oftentimes we allow our ordinary to limit our view of God's extraordinary. And we'll kind of dig into that theme here today, but we allow our ordinary to limit our view of God's extraordinary. So when our circumstances kind of catch us off guard, right? When we're faced with something that we didn't see coming, you know, when we have these moments, we have sort of our ordinary response. We have our ordinary kind of go-to move, that thing that we just naturally step into when something kind of goes awry. And you know, I know for me, you know, I kind of start looking at stuff and I'm like, okay, so how can I fix this? What can I do? What tools do I have within me to fix the situation? And I don't know if it's just me or if you guys kind of do that too, but you start kind of brainstorming. You know, you're just thinking, okay, so how do I deal with this? How do I handle this? How do I? And really, we start with options like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 before we actually start with what should be our number one option, which is going to God and seeking His advice, seeking His direction, seeking His wisdom in whatever we're facing. It's an opportunity for us to step in and just ask God, hey, what is your way out of this? Like we kind of talked about in our escape series. God, what is your path that you have for me to make it through this circumstance? And I know I've shared with you guys kind of my default move in circumstances. You know, I pick up the phone and I call somebody. Like, hey, here's my situation. What would you do? And I make probably 7, 8 phone calls. You know, get different input from different people. And then, of course, you know, I take to the web, start looking up stuff. Start thinking about, okay, what can I do? What can I do? Who do I know? Who can I reach out to? And I start going through my process. I start going through my own wisdom, my own knowledge, my own understanding. Those things My steps that should be number 3, 4, 5, and 6 on my list, those get bumped up to the top, right? And so I've shared that with you guys, and I've been using this example of our church plant a lot lately because it just seems so applicable to everything we're talking about, because there's so much uncertainty. There are so many different circumstances, and it's just crazy. It's chaotic, and as much as we try to have formulated a perfect plan for execution, as much as we want to have everything just right, it never happens. Like, there were issues this morning that maybe you guys didn't even see or notice, but there are things that it's like, okay, well, this didn't go exactly the way, we should have had this ready or whatever else, but there's just so many things, and this is like the biggest thing that Heather and I have ever ventured into outside of getting married and having children. This is the biggest thing that we've ever ventured into that really, truly is outside of our understanding, is outside of our normal, our ordinary. And so all the uncertainty, all the twists and turns, all these things that are happening through this process, they're stretching us. They're stretching our faith. They're stretching my faith. And most of you know that we just recently found out that Lancaster County is not going to allow us to continue using the school come summer because new school is opening. They're getting everything ready there. This school is going to be converting to a middle school. And so in that process, they're going to be doing some remodeling around here. And so we just don't have access to this facility. That's really stressful for me. That is really stressful for me. We spent the last 7 months looking at different places. We spent the last month looking and trying to dig in and find a good place. No, a great place for us to host our gatherings. And it just seemed like door after door after door was closed, and this one is the one that just kind of kept popping up. So we walked through it, and now here we are, and it's like, yes, we've got our spot. Just to have it pulled away from us in 7 months? God, what is going on? And my ordinary response to this is to call a handful of people and start asking them, hey, what do you know? Anything come up that you know about? Any place that we could go rent? Do you have any funds you could throw us? Because we're about to have to pay a lot of money for a place to rent. Like I start going through my normal, ordinary process to navigate these circumstances in my power. And of course, I share my story with you guys because I want to let you know that I'm not perfect. I'm not presenting this stuff as I've got it all figured out and here's how you need to step in line so you can be with me. I'm not doing that at all. I'm sharing this with you so that you understand that I'm walking in this just like you are. And I'm trying to figure some of this stuff out, and we're all at different places in this journey. We've talked about this a lot. We're all on a journey with God, and we're all on a journey with Christ. And one of us will experience one thing here at this point in life so that we can invest that information into somebody else who walks through it at a different stage in their life, somewhere down the road from us. Someone else went through something. They're able to invest that into us. And so I want to share with you that my normal activity would be to seek refuge in my own ability and try to solve this problem. But I'm really trying to not do that. And what I'm learning is when I do that, when I take that activity, when I kind of grab onto the ball and try to run with it by myself without any other input, without God's direction, I find that things just kind of get a little bit sideways before they get right. All right? When I start trying to work from my own ability, when I try to work from my own wisdom and my own insight, what I see is that it just kind of takes a detour. It takes me a little bit longer to get there. It leads me into some things that maybe are worse than what we're currently in because I just don't know any better, right? I allow my ordinary move to kick in. And when I do that, when I allow my ordinary to kick in, it limits what I can see God doing. I limit the view that I have of God's extraordinary. When I'm reaching out in all of my human experience, trying to latch onto other human experience, it limits my view. It limits my view of God's extraordinary. And if we're all being honest, I mean, I hope I'm not the only one. I'm sitting here talking about this stuff, and you guys are like, yeah, you're an idiot. You're the only one in the room doing that. We've all got it figured out. If that's the case, great. Y'all pour into me, please. But I think if we're honest, I mean, if we're really being honest about this, like we all do that, right? There's something. You know, we can see something, we've had an experience before, and we see it pop up, and we go, okay, God, I need your guidance on this, because I've seen something like this before, I need your guidance on it. Like, we recognize it, and there are other things that kind of pop up, and we don't take that approach. We don't say, okay, God, I need your help in this. We just go, okay, I've got this. When different circumstances pop up, we have our ordinary responses. We have our ordinary. And when we do those normal things, it prevents us from recognizing and seeing and experiencing God's extraordinary in and through those circumstances. When our spouse speaks harshly to us, when we're at odds with each other, when there's strife, what is our ordinary response? What do you normally do? What do you usually do? Somebody yells at you, what do you do? What's your ordinary response? Normally, I yell back, right? When somebody's driving aggressively on the road, what is my ordinary response? You're not getting in front of me, you jerk. Our ordinary responses, how we normally seek solutions, our go-to moves, things that are achievable by our own understanding, solutions that are within our own power. These ordinary things, they get us into more trouble, but they really exclude us from seeing God's great power, from seeing His full ability, from seeing His hand at work. Now we may get there and we may see some portion of it, but when we seek refuge in ourselves, when we seek our own understanding, we miss out on the fullness. We miss out on the extraordinary. And it's our ordinary limits. It's our ordinary. It limits us. It limits how far we can go sometimes, right? If we respond in the only way that we know how to respond, sometimes, we just kind of get cut off. We don't get to reach our full potential. God may have had something special for us that was going to take us 2 weeks to achieve, and because we handled it ourselves, it's now going to take 6 months or 6 years, because He's going to have to adjust us. And when we look back in this passage in Ruth, and we go back and we see Naomi, and we see the impression of what she's going through, what she's been through. When we examine her view of her circumstances, we'll see that her response is pretty ordinary. It's pretty normal, right? We looked at this last week. It's chapter 1, verse 20. It says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Her response to her circumstances would likely be what our normal response would be if we had just lost our spouse and our children in a foreign land, right? Her response would be a normal, ordinary human response, right? That's kind of how we see things. We would slip into some bitterness. We might fall into some depression. We might become angry. But if we go back and we look at her statement, if we go back and we look at what Naomi says here, we'll see exactly how her ordinary allowed her to miss God's extraordinary. And this is really cool because it's so easy to miss. But she says, the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back. See, she was focused on how empty she was. She was focused on how bad things were. She was so focused that she missed the extraordinary, that God actually brought her back. She's locked in her normal response, her normal thought process of being afflicted, of being opposed. She was seeing all the downside in her situation. And if we pause for a moment, we think about, had she paused for a moment, she would have noticed that God had brought her back. The Lord had brought her back. Yes, she felt empty, but instead of being thankful that she had been brought back, she was feeling this negative bitterness. She was looking at all the bad. But if she had just paused and maybe had a different and unordinary experience, as she responded differently, then she would have seen the full activity of God in her life. Yes, the Lord had brought her home, and not only did He bring her home, He brought her home with a daughter, in essence. Her daughter-in-law came with her. The Lord has provided someone to walk in this life with her. She was brought back. Naomi's ordinary response allowed her to miss God's extraordinary activity. And that's where we find them today. We're going to look at chapter 2. We're going to kind of pick and choose a few of the verses here and kind of pass through some of this stuff pretty quickly. But I would encourage you in your spare time this week, as you're doing your quiet time, as you're reading your Bible, go back and really read through chapter 2 and really pick up on some of the things that maybe we don't mention here today. But here we are. We're in chapter 2. Naomi she's missing out on God's extraordinary because her view is limited by her circumstance. And she's limited by her depression. She's limited by her bitterness. She's kind of in a slump. She's seeing no way out because she's looking at what can I do with this? Like she says before they leave Moab, she says, girls, I'm an old woman. Even if I could find another man, the likelihood of me getting pregnant and then raising the child, and then you being able to marry them, are you willing to make that kind of sacrifice? I mean, she's seeing herself as at the end of her life. There's no way out. There's nothing that she can conceive of that could be better. There's no way for her to improve her life. But then Ruth, so great. Ruth poses this question, and the question that she poses is the actual turning point in the book here. And this is where things really kind of start getting interesting. But Ruth goes to Naomi and she says, will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor? Now keep in mind that Ruth has also lost a husband. She's lost her father-in-law. She's lost her brother-in-law. She's lost her sister-in-law, not to death, but her sister-in-law went back to her family in Moab. She's traveled away from her family, following her mother-in-law into an unknown land. I mean, if Ruth were to respond the same way that Naomi does, I mean, her circumstances seem pretty bleak, right? She's lost everybody that she knows and loves except for her mother-in-law. And if she were to have the same attitude as Naomi, would anyone really blame her? Would anybody really blame her if she were angry and depressed and bitter and looking at her circumstances as sort of the end of the line for herself? I don't think we would. We might actually join in with her pity party, right? Oh, girl, it's so bad, I know. Right? But she doesn't. She doesn't have that same kind of attitude. She actually responds in a way that is out of the ordinary. And she says, may I please, will you let me go out and gather grain? She recognizes that Naomi's not doing a whole lot to help their situation out. And she's like, look, we can sit here and be depressed and starve to death. But instead, Ruth stands up and she's like, let's go do something. And it's really interesting because the way Ruth says it, Ruth is expecting something special. She expects to find favor. She expects to find favor. Notice her statement again. Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I will find favor? With whom I find favor. She doesn't ask her, hey, do you know somebody I could go work with? She doesn't. She doesn't say, hey, can I go out and maybe see if I can sweet talk somebody to let me go work? No, she says, let me go out and gather grain in the field with someone with whom I find favor. She is expecting to walk out, to go into the community, and actually find something. She's expecting to walk out and find favor. She was stepping out of her ordinary response and stepping into something potentially extraordinary. She was expecting something extraordinary. And you see, the only way that we can experience extraordinary is sort of like Ruth. We have to escape our ordinary. The only way that we can experience extraordinary is by escaping our ordinary. Ruth went out. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't in a slump. She was optimistic. She was expectant. She was looking for a miracle. Ruth's attitude wasn't... She's lost her father-in-law. She's lost her husband. She's lost her brother-in-law. She was expecting to find something good. She was expecting to find favor. And Naomi just gave her the green light to head out. Naomi didn't give her directions to a field. Naomi didn't warn her about any of the unfriendly farmers in the community. Naomi didn't give her directions to a specific farm where she might find favor. She just says, yes, go. Go and see what you can do. So Ruth, a Moabite woman, goes out searching for a place to harvest food in Bethlehem. A Moabite woman in Bethlehem. She's despised just because she's Moabite. She's despised because she's a woman. And she walks out expecting something great to happen. She walks out expecting something extraordinary. Verse 3, so Ruth left and entered a field to gather grain behind some harvesters. She happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. Now, did you catch that? Ruth happened to be. She just blindly wandered into a field owned by Boaz. It's just so accidental, right? She just happened to wander into the field. She's out roaming around and she just stumbles into a field that is owned by a man. Your circumstance is not happenstance. She just happened to walk into the field. Ruth left Naomi's side expecting something to happen. She went out looking for a miracle. She was seeking something extraordinary. And I don't believe that God's providence is on accident. Like, I really don't think that God operates accidentally. Right? How is it possible for the creator of the universe, for the guy who raised Jesus from the dead, who has defeated death and hell, how is it possible for the most powerful being in the universe to do something by accident? It doesn't compute, right? God doesn't do anything by accident. There is no happenstance. When we pray, Lord, put someone in my path today that needs to know you so that I might share the gospel with them, He'll do it. And you know, I don't know if you're like me or not, when that happens, when you actually say that prayer, because I try not to say it too much because it actually happens. But when you say that prayer and it actually happens, if you're like me, you're like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? Oh, I prayed for that and God actually ordained it. He made it happen. He brought my path and this other person's path to collide. It happens because God is an extraordinary God. He does extraordinary things. He's working in extraordinary ways. And when we're submitted to Him, when we're asking to be used by Him for something that is according to His will, to do something spectacular, something exciting, something extraordinary, He will use us. And it won't be by accident. It won't just happen to happen. And I can tell you, again, using the church plant as the example, because, oh my gosh, there are so many things that have just come together that are outside of my control, that are outside of anything that Heather and I could have done to make happen. I mean, us landing at First Baptist and being introduced to Jeff, and through that being introduced to the Johnsons, and just having these introductions to all these different people, and then having the introduction into this school, and having some relationships with this school, and all these different things. And it's just like, are they all circumstantial? Were they all accidental? No. God is doing something. God's brought all of you here to be part of the Indian Land Community Church story. Whether you realize it or not, He's brought you here. He's led you here. He's prompted a conversation between you and somebody else. He's done something to have what we might think is a chance meeting and a chance discussion. God's working. He's doing something on purpose. He's doing something extraordinary. So here's Ruth. She's guided this field that belongs to Boaz, and she goes humbly. She goes over humbly, and she sees the guy who is kind of the boss. He's the project manager. He's overseeing all the work that's being done in the field. And she goes and she inquires and asks if she can go and collect grain that's fallen off the harvester's baskets, right? She's not asking to go with the harvesters and collect all the good stuff. If they just happen to drop something, can I please just go pick it up? Ruth goes and she gets in line behind everybody who's already working, and she's just trying to find little bits and pieces and scraps and collect those. And then Boaz, the guy who owns the land, the guy who has the right to all of the crops in this field, he shows up, he comes home, and he notices Ruth in the field, and he inquires about her. He finds out who she is, and then he approaches her, and he says to her, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here, close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? When you're thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled." Boaz steps into God's extraordinary. He came home, rolls up to the field, and he sees Ruth, who was directed to this field. And he catches her eye. He notices that she's there, and he inquires about who she is, and he finds out who she is, and then he goes and he speaks to her. You see, Boaz becomes part of God's extraordinary answer to Ruth's problem. Boaz steps into God's extraordinary story of how he is going to care for Ruth and Naomi. Boaz goes over to Ruth and says, "Girl, it's dangerous out here. I want you to stay with my female workers." And I've already told the guys, see, he has a no sexual harassment policy, right? He probably had it on the wall of the barn, right? Yeah. I've instructed the men not to mess with you, not to harass you, but stay close to these women just in case. And if you get thirsty, feel free. Go partake of the water that we're providing for our workers. Go and do this. He encourages her. Boaz steps in and he encourages Ruth to continue doing what she is doing. Ruth, while she left Naomi expecting something extraordinary to happen, she didn't know what it would be. Ruth left saying, let me go and find somewhere where I'll find favor. Let me go find a field where I'll get some favor from somebody, and I'll just pick us some grain, and hopefully we'll have enough to come home and make some bread. She didn't know that she was going out to meet Boaz that day. She didn't know. She didn't know what kind of kindness, what kind of response she would find. But God was orchestrating. God was doing all of this stuff because He has an extraordinary plan. Oh, I missed turning the page for you guys when I was reading. My bad. There's always something. So picking up with verse 10, she fell face down, bowed to the ground, and she said to him, why have I found favor with you so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner? Her response is probably similar to what we would respond with, right? If we were to go to, say, England, and we've fallen on hard times, and we go and we are just collecting what we can collect, and all of a sudden somebody takes notice of us and engages us and is kind to us and encourages us to not just get the scraps, but to have some bounty, to have some of the first fruits, to have some of the goodness that they have. How would we respond? Why have I found favor in your eyes? And you see, this is what Ruth says, and Boaz tells Ruth, look, girl, I've heard about everything that you have done since your husband has died. I've heard about how you left your home country and you traveled with your mother-in-law to be here, and how you're taking care of her. Now, let me just kind of point out some obvious things here. Boaz did not have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, right? He didn't have every bit of information at his fingertips. So how is it possible that Boaz can walk up to Ruth and say, I've heard your story. I've heard about how you've lost your husband. And I've heard that you had an opportunity to go back and be with your family, but you didn't do that. You went with your mother-in-law, and you've cared for her. And even now, you're out here. And where is she? You're out here taking care of her. You're out here collecting grain to help provide food. See, Boaz was part of an extraordinary story. There are a lot of things that God had orchestrated in the background of all of this stuff so that Boaz would have Ruth's story, right? How? How is it possible that Boaz wanders up to his field and here's Ruth? And he just happens to say, oh yeah, I know you. I've heard all about you. God was working. He was working ahead of Ruth and Naomi. He was preparing a way for them to find favor. God was doing something extraordinary. And what we see in this is that God uses faithful people to do extraordinary work. God uses faithful people to do extraordinary work. Boaz goes above and beyond the ordinary activity in his treatment of Ruth. He gives her full access to the grain. He invites her to join for a meal after they're done. Or maybe it's a break in the middle of the day, but he invites her to the table to share some food. And Ruth eats until she's full. Ruth eats and eats. And at the end of the day, Boaz says, "Here, we got all this left over. Why don't you take it with you? Plus you have all this grain that you've collected." I mean, she collected a lot of grain. I mean, it was like a bushel and a half, I think is what it equates to. She collected a lot of grain, and she's being sent home with excess food. With excess food. When Ruth returns home, or wherever they are, with Naomi, when she gets there and she informs her of the activity of the day, Naomi seems to perk up a little bit. Her attitude seems to shift some. She shows signs of recognizing God moving in a positive way in her life, and she says, "May the Lord bless the man who noticed you. May the Lord bless the man who showed you favor." And then, of course, Ruth informs Naomi that it's Boaz who showed her favor. And it's just like this light kind of came on. It's like this light kind of came on for Naomi. She recognized that Boaz is part of Elimelech's family and that he's a redeemer. Now, we're going to kind of dig into some redeemer stuff here a little bit later, but this is an important note. She realizes that Boaz is a redeemer in the family. And in that culture, in that day, a redeemer in a family. So in Naomi's case, with Elimelech dying, Boaz, being a redeemer, could have married her. And had they not had children, she could have had children with him. And they would have carried on Elimelech's name. But there's more to this whole redeemer thing. There's a lot more responsibility. There's a lot more that kind of plays into this. But she remembers, she recognizes that Boaz is a redeemer and that she's part of Elimelech's family. And now, Naomi starts to be encouraged. And she starts to be an encouragement to Ruth. Stick with Boaz. Do what he directs you to do. He's keeping an eye on you. He's helping us in this circumstance. All of a sudden, through Ruth's happening into Boaz's field, and Boaz just happening to come home at the right time so that she's still close to where he is, and because they just happened to have this exchange, and because somehow Boaz knew the story of Ruth and all that she had gone through, it all just sort of happened? No. God had his hand in all of it. He was orchestrating the different things, and he was inviting them into a greater story. He was inviting them into something extraordinary, out of their ordinary. Naomi starts to kind of turn a corner a little bit because of Ruth's experience, because Ruth acted outside of her normal, outside of her ordinary. And she went out expecting something. She expected a miracle. Naomi encourages her, stick with Boaz, do what he says. And Ruth does as she's directed, and she continues to work with Boaz until the end of the harvest. Ruth stepped outside of her ordinary, and she went out expecting something. How many times do we walk out expecting something? How many times do we face a circumstance and we expect an extraordinary outcome? I can say I don't expect that very often. Why? Why not? Why are we not stepping out every day expecting something extraordinary? Because we serve an extraordinary God. And if he uses faithful people to do extraordinary work, why aren't we seeing more extraordinary work? Am I just not being faithful enough? Ouch. I'm telling you, this stuff resonates inside of me before it comes out to you. We allow our ordinary to limit our view of God's extraordinary. And one of our big challenges for today is to remember that when life fails, God still prevails. When life fails, God still prevails. So when we're in our circumstance and it looks like literally all hell is breaking loose around us, when it looks like everything that is in my control is out of control, when it feels like my life is falling apart, God is still standing there. And He still has a plan to pull it all back together. We can't see the exchange that happens with someone in Boaz for him to learn who Ruth is. We don't see all of the stuff that's in the works around us. But when life fails, God still prevails. When we come to the end of our own strength, when we come to the end of our own ability, when we come to the end of our own knowledge and understanding, and we finally cry out to God, and we're like, God, I'm at the end of my rope. I don't know what else to do. And He's there. He's ready to prevail. He's ready to come in and do something extraordinary. And we have some prevailing principles that we need to keep in mind as we're experiencing our different circumstances and as we want to be faithful people that God uses for extraordinary actions. One thing that we need to remember, one principle that we need to remember is to look beyond our circumstance. Look beyond our circumstance. Chapter 1, Naomi, she's looking her circumstance dead in the face, and it defines who she is. She allows it to make her bitter, and it defines her bitterness. Look beyond your circumstance. Remember who Christ says you are. Embrace the person that Jesus says you are. Look beyond your circumstance. Don't let it define you. Our second prevailing principle is act faithfully in your circumstance. Again, God wants to use faithful people to do extraordinary things. Remember that God is for you. He has a best plan for your life. And if we remain faithful and we pursue Him, if we seek first His kingdom, if we seek first His plan, if we seek first His wisdom, if we seek first what He wants us to do, then we will encounter some extraordinary things. Act faithfully. Jesus, a lot of times in the New Testament, He talks about the lack of faith. And He encourages people to increase their faith. He says, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can tell this bush to go replant itself in the ocean and it'll do it. A mustard seed is minuscule. It's tiny. If we have just that much faith, this is what we can do. If we act faithfully in our circumstances, just imagine what extraordinary things God will allow us to be part of. And our third prevailing principle in this is just to remember to let God be God in the midst of your circumstances. And by that I mean just recognize that God is working. God's working. Let God be God. Let Him be your provider. Let Him be your safe haven. Let Him be your refuge. Let Him be your wisdom and your strength. Let God be God in your circumstances. In our process with this whole thing, with the church plant, I remember praying, God, give us favor. Give us favor in the community. Give us favor in the school. Give us favor with the students. God, go ahead of us. prepare the way for us. When we let God be God, and we let Him do the work that He needs to do, and then we act faithfully, and we take the step that we need to take, imagine the extraordinary things that we will see happen. When our ordinary prevents us from seeing God's extraordinary, we just miss out on so much. Our bottom line today is that if we'll just adjust our ordinary response to experience an extraordinary God, if we can just adjust our ordinary response, then we can experience an extraordinary God. Again, we let our ordinary block our view of God's extraordinary, but if we adjust our response, then we can experience an extraordinary God. We can be part of an extraordinary thing that He's doing in our lives, through our lives, and the lives of those around us. If we just adjust the way we respond. I want to share with you, in light of this information of us not having access to the school this summer, I haven't picked up the phone and made a bunch of phone calls to try to find places. I haven't beat up a bunch of realtors trying to get information. I've just simply floated a few prayer requests out. Just floated a few prayer requests out. I prayed, God, thought we were good for a while, man. And you obviously have something different for us. Help me to be faithful in this. And when I ask God, what do you want me to do right now? The thing that I just keep getting hammered with is pray. Invite other people to pray with you. Go ahead and make those phone calls, but don't ask for information. Ask them to pray. Allow me to do something extraordinary. Just adjust the way you're responding to your circumstance and let me do something extraordinary. I've already got some things working. I have no idea what they are, but He's got something working. And I can tell you just over the last week, as I've mentioned this prayer request to a few people, I've gotten several phone calls with people confirming, hey, we're praying for you, and we're thinking about how we can help you in this. People that I haven't heard from in a long time are reaching out and saying, hey, we want to step in. We want to be part of God's bigger picture plan in this process. And we're praying for you. I'm expecting Him to guide us to where He wants us. I don't want my ordinary to limit my view of His extraordinary. I don't want my ordinary responses, my normal responses, to limit what I see Him doing. What we see Him doing, what we experience Him doing. And as we close, I want you to think about what your response needs to be today. I want you to think about what you maybe need to adjust so that you can experience an extraordinary God. What do you need to change? What is your ordinary move? What does it look like? And how does it need to shift so that you can engage and experience an extraordinary God? Let's pray.